Hi, everybody. My name is Joe GigWorks. I'm the CEO and managing partner of GigWorks. And today, myself and Christian Hollen, who is our enterprise architect, are going to be presenting this webcast around moving to the Microsoft cloud. Now, what we find a lot as we talk to customers, especially our enterprise customers, is you have a lot of choices out there now in the Office ecosystem as to where to store content and collaborate. You know, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and now Azure Blob storage. But with those choices, how do you come to that decision point? How do you move your content there? And ultimately, how do you make it work for end users? So Christian and I will be exploring those topics and then showing Nintex as part of the solution to create a unified user experience as it relates to where this content is. So again, really common question. And as you go to the Microsoft Cloud, what platform? And this is driven by feature, governance, and price. Further, how do you move all that content? And we have just a couple of slides I'm referencing to Quest and AvePoint. And the reason why we're singling these two companies out today is they also will move your Nintex workflows as part of that cloud migration strategy. And then as part of that, now that you've started to move content, you have a way to move your rich Nintex assets that you've developed on-premise. How do you use Nintex, and particularly NWC, to ensure that your customers have an optimal end user experience that drives adoption and drives business value, which in large measure are one and the same? So in terms of today's agenda, a little bit about who we are, advantages of the Microsoft Cloud and why you should go there, and then getting into the nuts and bolts of it, what to consider, which platform to use, how to move that content, and then a demonstration around an end user experience to drive adoption and business value using Nintex. So GigWorks, entering our 20th year, is a high-end information architecture firm. We've long been virtual technology experts for Microsoft in New York, as well as virtual technology experts for Nintex. Won a whole bunch of awards over the years, but we've always been focused on information architecture, which is a part and parcel along with user experience and user adoption. So information architecture has wrapped around it user experience and user adoption, and all this is to drive business value, right? If you build a toolkit that people can't access, that it's not intuitive, well, the whole thing falls apart. So this has always been our primary focus. Additionally, obviously, workflow and process automation. We're the premier Nintex partners globally. And as part of our methodology, we really do an absolutely amazing job of implementation through Agile. I don't want to derail today's presentation, but Agile is really the way to do these things. However, doing it successfully, well, that's something we do quite well. So a little bit about Nintex, which we're going to be demoing at the end of this. It is by far the most complete process management and automation platform in the industry today. Especially with Nintex Workflow Cloud, more power than ever, and no dependency on SharePoint anymore, ostensibly. Runs independent of that platform. And I have an expression that, be it within our sister company, Project Ready, as an ISV, when you look at the Teams paradigm, user experience, UX, is the new middleware, and that's what we're going to bring to bear toward the end. And so this is a quick swath of the various tools, if you will, at your disposal and products that Nintex offers. And then let's get into the Microsoft Cloud itself. I just want to make sure we have enough time for presentation and QA. So I don't think it comes as a big surprise. This is well known in the marketplace, but it warrants repeating what the advantages of going to the Microsoft Cloud are. We have a number of our clients are, looking at the cost and the spend on a data center and all the overhead and expense, again, around the administration and the uptime. So in the case of the Microsoft Cloud, your infrastructure costs, support, this is all provided as part of your subscription. And you always have the latest and greatest availability of Microsoft products. It's accessible anywhere. You can pick your data centers where you want it to be. And it's actually financially backed with a surface level agreement from Microsoft for a 99.9% uptime. And predictable costs. Another thing we've heard over the years as we deal with our clients is the desire to have IT expenditures to be more operational, OpEx versus CapEx. And this is one of the many advantages of the Microsoft Cloud. And flexible bandwidth, security and compliance and privacy, which they just continue to up the ante on, just built into your toolkit. And of course, the speed to market, the ability to get a solution up and running quickly. And with this, and as we get into it, more and more ways to take advantage of that infrastructure. So affordable storage, a number of ways to, a number of platforms to work within the system to store that. And of course, all the security around Active Directory, the responsiveness, and modern cloud applications. We've had this in previous webcasts. Happy to share that with folks later. But modern cloud applications port from on-premise to the cloud. This is something we recommend to people that as they're getting ready for their cloud journey to start retooling customizations in-house to be scalable to work in both locations. And now, let's to the meat of it, going to the Microsoft Cloud, which platform to use. So start with SharePoint. SharePoint, tried and true, and absolutely the world's greatest adopted collaborative platform. As we worked with SharePoint going back to 2005, one of the things you found was that, you know, it was taxonomy was all over the place. There were tons of subsites, and we'll get to the role that Teams takes in that regard. But what SharePoint has always done and continues to shine in is as the place of official record, right? This is where authoritative material around marketing, HR policies, official copy, templates, and it's intended for company-wide, secured, and governed content that's authoritative. And so with it, fully governable, the ability to set permissions and audit trails. And again, these policies of retention, disposal of documents, and the ability to leverage e-discovery and compliance. Now you get to OneDrive. OneDrive has been around for a while. And the thing to be clear about with OneDrive is what it's good at and what it's not. And that's today's point of today's webcast. So OneDrive, first and foremost, replaces that H drive share that everybody's had. My documents, to bring you back to the 90s, because I've been in this for a while. And so the best use of OneDrive is for personal content. That personal content also includes working copy that at a later point you may commit to SharePoint as an official record. And it's a safe place to keep private content for yourself. However, it is absolutely administrable and accessible in case employees leave. You don't have to get into their physical machine. Admins can access that, and this content can appear in search. So it's a safe place to keep that private content. And then the real seductive aspect of it is the storage volume itself. 1 terabyte per user is really quite a profound amount of storage capacity that the platform represents. And of course, on-the-go portability. I'm always hitting and editing documents off of my phone. But its intention is that it is not structured or governed in sort of a content-regulated way. And one of the big, we think, misappropriation of the platform is we see companies go, well, look, we have a lot of file folders. This is really cheaper than dirt. You know, let's just throw everything up there. But that's not its point. And the fact that you can put folders in and it has a large storage volume should not be the decision point by which you store things. So personal copy, working content, that's the applicable use of OneDrive. But to use it as a central repository of authoritative content is just not what it was intended to do. So where do you put working draft? How do you collaborate? And this ties back to my first set of comments around SharePoint. Back in the day, you know, you go in 2000 to 2007 to a 2010 migration, people had no idea how many sites they had. It was just sprawling all over the place. And so they had that central site, that governed site within SharePoint. But every time they had a board meeting or there was an HR initiative, we're going to switch out from one PPO to another. We're going to go from ADP to Paychecks. Those sites were being spun up, used for a short period of time, and then to really collaborate it, you're booting up Skype on the side, and none of it connected. And so Teams is absolutely the classic example of the user experience is the new middleware. So Teams is where you go to have a collaborative conversation that's structured in context around that conversation. It's a cohesive access to a team of people you work with, but it's intended for small group collaboration. It will declutter your primary intranet where authoritative content lives. And in terms of governance, Office 365 groups, group-based permissions, and it's very simple and easy to use and facilitates self-governance. So with this, you got Skype, video, well, it's not Skype, but Skype-like, right? Video, retention of all these conversations, it's auditable, and it's all in the context of small group collaboration that helps drive content and ideas that would go into the structured areas of SharePoint itself. And moving along to the latest edition, if you will, and something that we really think is particularly game-changing. So we work with media firms, and we work a lot with architecture, engineering, construction firms. Well, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, the way it stores content in its own SharePoint libraries on the back end, that system just can't accommodate certain types of files, right? So if you're working within the Adobe Creative Suite and you have to edit movie files, if you're working with Navisworks or Inventor on the engineering side, what do you do with those files that still have a reliance on UNC and SMB protocols? Further, where do you put just large files? You want to store installers or whatever. And so that's sort of that was the last piece that was keeping people on-prem, was the need for just bulk storage and UNC and SMB protocols so that certain types of files could work. So Azure Blob storage will mount onto your desktop, look just like a file system. It operates just like a file system, but it has remarkably fast upload and download times. It's not throttled, if you will, like the browser is when you upload, so you can upload very, very large files. And it's secured using Active Directory. And so Microsoft, more than any other company on earth, there's a reason why their success persists, has really come up with an incredibly integrated platform of choice that's centrally regulated and secured, governed, and auditable. And so Azure Blob Storage, as it's matured, Active Directory as a security mechanism, if you will, recently added in the last quarter, that was the missing piece for us so that we can answer our clients what to do with those remaining types of files and content that still needed some place to operate and still needed certain protocols to satisfy their end users' requirements and the applications they use to interact with those files. So how do you move that content? Now, there's a lot of choices out there, but the reason why we are pointing out Quest and AvePoint is because, for one, they are the premier companies in the industry. If you've been in IT for a minute or 10 years, you know them. But more importantly, they have a really wide swath of tools that allow you to analyze this content, move this content, and last but not least, for those of you who are using Nintex, the ability to migrate and analyze those Nintex workflows to see what will go up there and minimize that very critical part of that migration pattern. When you get into upper enterprises, 1,000 seats and up and the like, there are a lot of customizations that have been out there. There's a lot of Nintex customers out there, thousands upon thousands, who as part of the movement of that content need to move the workflows that go with it. So Quest, and certainly through its acquisition of Metalogix, and AvePoint give you the tools you need to go to those repositories, have a number of pre-built connections to various systems, and again, we'll move Nintex as part of that. So with that introduction, I want to hand it over to Christian Hollen, our Enterprise Architect and Director of Client Sales, to show now how to use Nintex to drive adoption regardless of where this content is stored.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the intro. So Joe gave a good introduction on how to get to the cloud, what components you have available for document storage, and the content repositories that are at your disposal. And part of what we're trying to do today is to educate you on the applicability of those. And at the end, we have a link to a podcast that we did where we went into detail on more of those individual use cases. But what we always want to do, once we know what we have at our disposal, is how do we drive end user experience and how do we drive adoption of these technologies? Now, one of the companies that we partner with very closely with is Nintex, and I'm going to show you a use case that we had built out in the Microsoft Cloud using Nintex to orchestrate some of the automation components to allow you to essentially build an effective user experience for a bunch of different roles of users that are involved in a particular use case. Now, why that's so valuable and why that's important is you have the whole Nintex Process Cloud. It can take advantage of both content that's running in SharePoint Online. It can access services like Azure, if you're running Azure Functions, or if you have Azure Blob storage that has REST endpoints. So you can access all these different components. You can run workflows inside of the Nintex Workflow Cloud, for example, if you have an extranet and you want to interface with people that are outside your organization. Facilitates this entire process. And really why we bring Nintex to the table and why we have it why they're one of our close partners is it allows you to create a seamless user experience. You can create a form and a workflow in a variety of different areas, and you can surface them in different parts of the Microsoft Cloud. And I'm going to show you an example of that where we have an investment form that's actually living in Teams that's built in a SharePoint site that creates an extranet in SharePoint Online that runs through NWC. And all these components will come together to create the seamless user experience that starts with the investor starting the process and then moving through into the legal review section. So part of why we like to bring the Nintex Workflow Cloud into this discussion is it works very well as a bridge between different systems. And one of the cloud questions that we get a lot in the industry from our clients is, how do you do an extranet, right? That's always a big question is, do you bring people in? Do you share out sites? How do you send notifications? What if they don't have a login? How do you interface with that? How do you move stuff between systems? What if you have, you've got a Dropbox, but all your system of record is in SharePoint Online in a protected library? Well, NWC really has a lot of answers to that, and we're going to go over part of where this fits into our use case today. It's built for the cloud. It has native cloud connectivity to a number of different systems, including the Microsoft Cloud. So it's part of this toolkit. You can scale very quickly. You can build these workflows in very short order and start integrating with different systems because it's cloud aware. It's online. You log in, you start building things, and again, it speaks to that time to market piece that Joe had brought up earlier. You can put things together very quickly. So the use case that we want to take you through today is a very common use case that we see, especially being in the New York region where there's a lot of financial services in this area, is legal review. Now, a lot of times you'll have a financial services company that outsources their legal review. Some of them have internal legal teams, but a lot of them will use a vendor. You'll hire a legal company on a retainer, and then you'll have a direct contact, and they don't have a login into your system because they're not an employee, but nevertheless, they're going to interface with you a lot. They're going to work with you on contracts and disclosures and reviewing documents and doing that redlining and copy. So they're part of your team, and you have to be able to account for that. And why we bring these tools to bear is to help build that user experience, to make that consistent. So this is the overview of the use case that we're going to walk through. Investor is going to initiate a new investment. They're going to identify whether or not legal review is needed. They're going to pick who that's going to go to. And then I'll show you how Nintex orchestrates the automation of creating the assets that are required to get that work done. And then you'll see really where that comes into play, how Nintex really brings all of that stuff to bear to finalize and put together this user experience for you. And last but not least, we'll go into a little bit of how we built it and show you some of the under the hood stuff. So it starts with the first two, and this is the component that I'll show you initially, is the initial investment and the identification of the review team. So here we have Microsoft Teams. Sure, we're all familiar with this. We've all seen this before. And so what we have here is we have a Nintex form that was built in an Office 365 SharePoint Online list, and it's being surfaced inside of Microsoft Teams in our investments team general channel. And we have a tab here called New Fund. So all of our internal investments employees, all those investors, they can go in, they can go right to their team, to their general channel, pull up the New Fund tab, and it will open up this form for them. allow them to initiate a new investment, set target fund values, any other information you want to put in here as well. These are very dynamically configurable forms. And then actually pick whether or not external legal approval will be necessary, and then determine which legal counsel they have on retainer they would like to use for this. In this case, we're going to pick this company here. And so this form is living in a SharePoint Online site, but again, it's being surfaced in Teams. So again, we're talking about consistent user experience. You have an investment team. They have a team in Microsoft Teams. They have a general channel. You know, they're doing their conversations. They're talking about their clients. This is the place where they want to work, right? So bring the functionality to them to give them the user experience that they're looking for. And the cloud offers that functionality right out of the box. So where this ultimately ends up, and this ties into why we push SharePoint Online as your system of record, is this form then generates these records inside of your investments list. So our fictitious Services Corp company here, we have our investments portfolio site where these investments are getting loaded in. So this is our system of record data, right? It's being generated out of Teams when our investors are, working together. They initiate a new investment, and then that record goes in here. So now we've moved over to SharePoint Online, and this is starting to see some of the stuff that's under the hood. Now what happens is when one of these investments is created, Nintex will automatically pick up that event and will kick off a workflow and determine whether or not legal counsel is required, and then take the appropriate actions to do so. And so this is where we move on to the orchestration, creation of the extranet, notification to the legal review team. So what we're actually going to do here is we're going to create a dynamic workplace for our legal team to collaborate with our investment team. And so we bring Nintex Workflow Cloud into this, because part of what happens is when you're in SharePoint Online and you have Nintex Workflow Cloud, you have the ability to interface them with each other. So one can start a workflow there, the other one can start a workflow here. And so when you need to jump out of the organization to deal with an extranet-like activity, in this case, we have an email notification that's going to our legal services, to our legal company, Azure Legal LLP. We have them on retainer. We know who they are. We're going to send them a notification that says, hey, we've created this site. You can see the link that's embedded in there. And this is all done right when that investment is submitted. So the system knows how to do this. It goes out to Nintex Workflow Cloud. Those two components are integrated. And then it actually provisions this extranet for them to work in, sends them a notification, and now you have your extranet provisioned with access to this external user. And this is all done automatically. So it's taking away a lot of this manual labor that you would normally otherwise go through to create this. And you're leveraging the content storage areas and the user experience that you need in order to pull this off. You've got your investors and teams, you've got your external people, your legal counsel outside getting their email notifications from you automatically. They know what those are. And so this is the extranet, basic site. It's just a document library with a couple of files in there. Now these files didn't come from nowhere. They came from a dedicated repository of legal copy that we have. So I'm going to show you how we built that. And then at the end of this, we're going to open it up for Q&A. We want to give you guys an opportunity to ask us how we built this, what we do, any questions about it, or more discussion on the cloud and the different types of storage options that you have. So as I'd mentioned previously, Nintex Workflow Cloud can interface with SharePoint Online and vice versa. They can interface with each other. They can talk to each other. You can pull documents out of a dedicated library in SharePoint Online, and you can bring those into the extranet. So here we have the legal copy. Now you see, if for those of you who are watching the navigation highlights at the top here, our investments list was the first thing we looked at, and now we're looking at our legal copy list. So this is in the same SharePoint site with our investment portfolio. So we're grabbing these files here. These are our templates, our boilerplates, and we're putting those in the extranet for our legal team to review. Now the way this works is fairly straightforward. Nintex has first-party actions. We call them first-party, where they talk directly to SharePoint Online. You can get files and store files. You can move files around from site to site. Those can then trigger other workflow events. So if you put a file in a library, that can start up a workflow that requests approval for it automatically, and that happens inside your organization, whereas NWC can happen outside. It's your tenant, it's your NWC tenant, right? And it's still secured and it's running in Azure, and you have the delegated access to your Office 365 environment. So I don't want you to think that this is just sort of, automatically figuring this out. You're governing all of this along the way. But once you've done that, once you've set up these connections, it's really just a matter of dropping a few actions in here and instructing Nintex on what to do. So on the Office 365 SharePoint Online version of this, you see we're creating a site. We're checking to see if the legal counsel is required, and we're creating that extranet site. And that's what's provisioning this. So under the hood, this is a fairly simple implementation. It doesn't take a lot of putting together to really get a consistent, clean user experience for all of the people that are involved in this particular use case. So I wanted to hand it off for Q&A, open up the floor. Joe, Ricky, back to you.
And just very quickly, yes, just wanted to point this out, that we do have a longer conversation between myself and Christian, available on SoundCloud. We've also posted it up onto LinkedIn. So, and it's going to be a two-part series. So just want to point that out as well. It's a free-form discussion, and we think pretty informative.
Okay. First question I have here is, does the Microsoft Cloud support multi-factor authentication?
Yes, multi-factor authentication is natively supported in the cloud. Once you activate it through Azure Active Directory, that flows through to all of the applications that use Azure Active Directory, including Office 365, SharePoint Online, Teams, and whatnot, so that you can effectively enable MFA for those protected assets.
Okay, another question here. Is this workflow mobile platform compatible?
That is also a yes, definitely. Part of the benefit of having this type of user experience is that those forms are also accessible on mobile devices. So if you're using tablets, or if you're using phones, if you're on the road, if you're on the go, or if you're a remote employee, you can also build user experiences tailored to those devices, and you get the same controls, the same user experience, the same look and feel consistently between both. If you were running that in Teams, or if you're running that in the desktop browser, or if you're running that on a tablet.
Okay. Another question here. Can you choose what region your content is stored in?
And yes, that's also something we get. That's a very frequent question we get asked. And there are two ways you can do that. In Azure, if you're creating Azure Blob storage accounts, you can decide where those go, which sort of region of their data center you want that to be in. And SharePoint Online also has a new component where you can decide where a site collection actually gets stored. So if you're creating a site for a team that's in Europe, you can use a European data center, and that site collection will be aligned to that region.
Okay, another question here. What options are available in Office 365 to choose when to upgrade or updates forced?
So there are different update rings with Office 365. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but there are different options that you have for doing that. You can also use Intune device management to apply the same types of updates to your Windows 10 devices if you're managing those through Intune. So you have options both on the SharePoint Online side, Office 365, as well as the managed desktop side.
Okay, another question here. Is it difficult to bring customizations and workflows with you into the cloud?
Well, that's a good question, right? And usually the answer is yes and no. So the reason why we bring up the third-party tools and the management, the migration tools, is a lot of those can automatically bring workflows up for you, especially when it comes to Nintex workflows. A lot of those components will know how to do that, migrate them over. And if you have certain pieces that aren't cloud compatible, it will leave sort of placeholder actions in place, and then you can go in and then refactor them. As far as customizations are concerned, if you're using SPFX or if you're using modern apps, those things will port up almost automatically. You can deploy those in, and there's not much work you need to do to get those running in the cloud. If you have legacy customizations, then generally you will have to go through a development cycle and adapt those to run in the cloud environment. But there are solutions in Azure, such as virtual machines, Azure Functions, where it will allow you to, basically, if you have something that has to run on a VM and you want to get it off your data center, create a VM in Azure and just run it on there instead.
Okay. What are common hybrid scenarios that you have seen customers adopt in the past that aren't ready to fully migrate to the cloud?
So hybrid scenarios are, one common hybrid scenario we see is where you have, for example, like an on-prem document repository that's been in use for a long time, and there's not a lot of good toolkits available to migrate content off of that. That's a fairly common scenario. But as far as hybrid's concerned, when you're running in a hybrid scenario, you're using both on-prem and cloud-based assets. So generally, you would set up either hybrid search so that the search indexes are consistent between the two, and you can get search results across both environments. It's a very popular scenario, but usually we see the difficulties in migrating and getting fully cloud aware is where you have a tool that you're using internally and it's difficult to migrate content off of it. That's generally the most common scenario.
Okay. Another question: how difficult is it to manage these storage platforms if you're using more than one?
So in terms of governance, so management is kind of a big term. There's governance, there's sizing management, there's permissions, there's all things like that. Starting just with permissions, Nintex allows you to do a lot of governance automatically using their tools. So you can set rights using workflow actions. You can govern access to content across the cloud using Azure Active Directory. Everything is securable through an Azure Active Directory account. That goes for Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint Online, and Azure Files. They all have the same backend. So that governance is consistent across. So if you have a user in Azure Active Directory, you can secure an asset in any one of those 4 document repositories using that user's credentials, essentially. Put them in a group, give them direct access, whatever the case may be. You know, in terms of content and sizing, you have different options depending on each platform. You know, Azure Files it's a file share. It's intended to be very simple and easy to maintain, and you'd have to log into the Azure portal to manage it. You know, Teams promotes self-governance. You create a team, it has members, it has an owner, and that owner may or may not add or remove members from it. And then if the team no longer is necessary, you can just remove all the people out of it and leave the owner there, and then it's just sort of resident for future use if you need that. OneDrive is intended to be sort of a personal folder. So if if your employee is let go or if they move on, their content stays there. It's tied to their account and no one else can access it unless you explicitly give somebody else access to it as an administrator to allow that to happen. And SharePoint Online really is the most manageable and governable of all those 4, because you can change the user experience, you can change the rights of who can change the user experience, you can add pages, you can enable information rights management policies and retention policies and publication rules, lots of things really you have access to in that. And so that also helps you decide what's the appropriate place for certain things, and that's why we suggest, you know, like official copy you put in SharePoint Online, collaborative team-based stuff you use Teams, you know, big archive files or large binaries you put in Azure Files, and then anything that your employees individually need to work with, you know, say they have to sign a document for HR, they got to fill out a tax form, right? And they got to email it to somebody, they're going to share it with their controller, right? You put it in your OneDrive so that it's just between the 2 of you.
Okay, I do think that is the last of the questions. So, Joe, if you want to wrap up, feel free.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. Hope it was informative. And again, we have two-part series around this podcast. One that goes into depth on the storage component and the subsequent one around the user experience with Nintex and beyond. So thank you as always. Please do come back the next time.